Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, austerity in Argentina, but will harsh medicine fix the economy? And what about the fallout for emerging markets? Also this week, the good, the bad, the ugly, the corporate world's impact on society and the environment, how ethical investing is making its presence felt. Plus, some consumers have been setting fire to their Nike trainers, and it's all because of a new ad campaign. We'll tell you more. Argentina's economic emergency. It's now the world's riskiest sovereign borrower behind Venezuela. Its currency, the peso, has halved in value this year versus the dollar. The country already has the highest interest rates in the world and is on financial life support. The president is cutting government spending, and the IMF is trying to accelerate a record $50 billion loan. But will these extraordinary measures work? Al Jazeera's Teresa Bo reports now from Buenos Aires on how the economic crisis is affecting the most vulnerable.
Over 300 people come to get a hot meal every day to this soup kitchen in Buenos Aires. The economic crisis is making life difficult for people like Cynthia Falco, who has 5 children and can barely make enough to survive.
It's difficult for me to say it, but the situation is horrible. We cannot afford to buy food. I'm worried about my children because if they don't eat, well, they get sick.
Vilma Acuña is in charge of the place and says there is a waiting list with hundreds of people who are waiting to be able to eat here.
The situation is difficult because we are getting help from the government, but it's not enough. If we don't get any more food, we can't take in any more people. It's difficult because people are hungry and they need us.
The peso has devaluated 100% in the past year, and that has had huge consequences in the poor neighborhoods of Buenos Aires.
The impact of the devaluation of the peso on food prices is something that worries those who are trying to help those in need. This year, the prices of food have already increased around 30%, something that makes it difficult for people living here to buy some basic food items like bread, pasta, and meat.
A few days ago, there was an attempt to loot a supermarket in the neighborhood. Similar situations happened in other parts of Argentina.
We were working and heard screaming. These young kids between 15 and 20. They tried to enter the market and loot. It's an example of how sensitive the situation is, and it seems that the crisis on TV every day is adding to the difficulties we already face. We are all suffering, but some groups feel that they have the right to go out and loot.
The government of Mauricio Macri is struggling to prevent an economic collapse and has announced austerity measures to reduce the fiscal deficit. Macri had acknowledged poverty rates are on the rise and announced he will give extra cash handouts for the poor. But Eduardo Donza says much more needs to be done.
Stopping inflation is crucial right now, but that's not going to solve everything. There has to be an increase in local production to generate jobs, and for that we need to see a creation of state policies and a government that has the clarity and humility to call on all sectors to cooperate.
The possibility of further rises in household basics have many in Argentina fearing for the future. In the meantime, there are those who are suffering the consequences of the crisis right now.
Well, joining us now from Lisbon in Portugal via Skype is Richard Segal. Richard's Senior Emerging Markets Analyst with Manulife Asset Management. Richard, welcome back to Counting the Cost. Whatever Mauricio Macri seems to do to try to prop up the peso, it doesn't work. Why is that? And is this beyond him?
There are 3 or 4 reasons. I would say that it's stabilized for now, the peso, at around 40 to the dollar, but it is very fragile. Among these factors are forthcoming elections, the very uncertain international environment, including Fed policy in the future, the Brazilian elections in a few months, but also just the general unease in Argentina about returning to the IMF and the LA possibility of capital flight.
10 years on, Richard, from the financial crisis, I mean, Argentina is not the only emerging market to be in trouble. Turkey is a problem too. What's the danger here? Are we likely to see a contagion, do you think?
The problems in these 2 countries are feeding off themselves. Weakness in Argentina leads to additional weakness in Turkey and back and forth. And this leads a lot of investors in the local markets to bail out because they don't want to take the chance. In addition, they can only incur more risk, especially as these two countries have lower weightings. For the time being, the contagion in the local markets has an impact on those investors, but not so much on the real economies, because countries such as India, Brazil, and Indonesia do have a lot of buffers, unlike Turkey and Argentina. But the big risk that we see moving forward is really the Brazilian elections, because the two major candidates are an unknown for the markets.
How exposed is the international investment community to Argentina's economy? And Argentina has already defaulted on its debt before. Could it happen again?
It certainly could. Because Argentina was frozen out of the markets for so long, its weighting is still relatively low, and therefore the impact is more going to be on investors locally, but also foreign direct investors. The chances of a default near term are low because they do have good relations with the IMF. But I think what needs to happen for the time being is that there needs to be a greater burden sharing. It had, up to now, mostly been on foreign investors and local taxpayers. It needs to be more on the corporate sector, which had been receiving a lot of subsidies, particularly, for example, to invest in energy and electricity, where there hadn't been any investment for 10 or 12 years, but also the foreign direct investors who are going to have to bear some of the additional losses.
That $50 billion IMF loan, is that going to be enough to fix Argentina's economy?
It will be, but looking back to previous balance of payments crises of this nature, whether it's Russia, Mexico, 20 more years ago, Indonesia, and the like, the important thing is that the measures need to be taken up front, but you won't know whether they will be successful for 6 or 12 months, and there will always be aftershocks. The main thing to do is just to maintain confidence, stick with the program, because if it is the right program, and chances are that in Argentina they are moving in the right direction, but be patient and not expect any overnight successes.
Richard, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. As always, many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, Argentina's sinking economy and currency crash is starting to have a negative impact on one of Latin America's most stable economies. Neighboring Chile has seen its peso slump in what's being called the tango effect. Our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, reports.
Santiago's Costanera Center is one of Latin America's largest and most modern shopping malls. Until recently, it was full of Argentines, conspicuous because they'd come with suitcases to shop till they dropped. Now they're still conspicuous by their absence.
Argentina
represents 52% of our tourism. Maybe we've been too dependent on them because when they fall into their periodic economic crisis, the impact here is very strong.
The fallout from Argentina's currency crash has already reached Chile, arguably Latin America's most stable economy. Carlos Vasquez is a chauffeur at a 5-star hotel.
For us, the drop in tourism will be terrible, especially now that the summer is coming. We count on Argentines to give us work.
And the so-called tango effect goes further.
There
is a direct impact on a large number of Chilean companies who've invested significantly in Argentina. Their stocks have dropped and so will their profits. It also affects trade because now it has become more difficult to export to Argentina.
While the overall impact may not be devastating, it comes at a very bad time. Chile's currency has dropped to a 2-year low because of the international trade conflict. And that's sharply pushed down the price of copper, Chile's primary export.
Unlike Argentina, the economy here is solid and much better placed to ride out adverse international conditions. But in these times of global interlinked economies, when a neighbor like Argentina gets pneumonia, Chile, at the very least, catches a bad cold.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, Netflix is showing 6 films at this year's Venice Film Festival, but not everyone's happy about it. But first, some of the stories catching our eye this week. Amazon's stock market valuation hit the $1 trillion mark, giving it entry to a club with only one other member, Apple. Shares in the online retailer are trading at around 207 times current earnings. That means that shareholders believe it will stay profitable in the future. CEO Jeff Bezos is now the richest person in modern times if you account for inflation. But the company he founded is being criticized by US politician Bernie Sanders. The senator claims that Amazon doesn't pay its lower-level employees a fair wage, something that Amazon says is misleading. Worries are growing about weak money laundering controls across the European Union. A small regional branch of Danske Bank, Denmark's biggest lender, has been setting off alarm bells. As much as $30 billion from Russia and other former Soviet countries flowed through the branch in a single year, according to a report. The branch in question was located in Estonia. And the term pre-crime was famously invented by science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, but it's a concept that's coming closer to reality. Japan wants to test how efficient technology like artificial intelligence is at predicting the likelihood of future crimes, including economic ones. Its national police agency is set to request $1 million for a pre-crime experiment in its budget for 2019. Now, some consumers set fire to their Nike trainers this week, and it's all because of a new ad campaign. Al Jazeera's Kristen Salumi reports from New York.
Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Nike's new Just Do It ad campaign is proving as controversial as one of the stars chosen to deliver it, former National Football League quarterback Colin Kaepernick. He hasn't played football since repeatedly refusing to stand for the national anthem before games during the 2016 season, prompting other players to follow suit.
Not only am I burning my favorite pair of Nikes, you are burning your sales.
The ad, like the protests, have provoked anger among some NFL fans and President Donald Trump. They consider it disrespectful to the American flag and the military. Some have called for a boycott of Nike products.
Love Nike enough. They made Colin.
But supporters say it's meant to call attention to racial injustices and is a respectful expression of free speech. Nike, which has a contract with the NFL to supply uniforms and sideline clothing, appears to be taking their side, also announcing a new catalog of Kaepernick's shoes and T-shirts. Sports branding experts say it's a calculated business decision.
To my take, they're going to be a rallying cry for those people to come and support Nike for what it's done, because it's bold, it's brave, it has risks. We want that from brands. We expect that from brands. And Nike's the kind of brand where you demand it to be on the edge all the time.
The former quarterback says team owners have colluded to keep him off the football field. NFL ratings have been in decline, though the reason is open to debate.
The NFL has struggled to come up with a policy regarding conduct during the national anthem that satisfies both players and critics such as the president. And with the opening game of the season scheduled for Thursday, fans are just as likely to be focused on the sidelines as they are on what's happening on the field.
Well, back in 1991, Nike was under pressure from activists to change the terrible conditions in its factories in Indonesia. It was forced to make changes or lose customers and investors. And consumers are increasingly searching for ways to find out just how ethical brands really are. Ethical watchdogs say that companies from big tech to big oil need to drastically improve transparency on their environmental and social impact. As awareness about these issues grows, so too is interest in something called ethical investing. Well, ethical investing is no longer just about avoiding the so-called sin stocks, gambling, alcohol and guns. Monitoring the social, environmental and governance of companies is a growing trend. McKinsey has estimated that a quarter of the $88 trillion of assets under management globally is now invested in these kinds of assets. Norway has the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world, and it's signed up. But does doing good in your investment portfolio improve your bank balance? We don't know yet, as there isn't enough information, and all investments have risks. But increasingly activist investors are putting pressure on companies to adopt ESG practices in order to improve long-term performance and company culture. And a future generation of investors is paying attention. Triodos Bank says that nearly half of 18 to 34-year-olds in the UK plan to invest in a socially responsible investment fund. Joining us now from London, Patrick Connelly. Patrick is a chartered financial planner with Chase de Vere, an independent financial advice company. Good to have you with us, Patrick. First of all, what exactly do we mean by ethical or responsible investment?
That's a really good question. Ethical investing is on a journey. The first ethical fund was launched by Friends Provident in 1984. At the time, it was probably unfairly dubbed the Brazil Fund because the argument was that you'd have to be nuts to want to invest into it. Traditional ethical investing is about excluding sectors which are deemed to do harm. So sectors such as weapons manufacturing, alcohol, gambling, tobacco. The idea being that if you invested in those, you're missing out on some high growth areas. And if you're missing out on high growth areas, then it's probably not a very good investment proposition. Now, what's happened in recent times is the concept of ethical investing has changed and is largely being replaced by something called ESG. Now, ESG stands for environmental, social and governance. And what companies do is look to invest in firms that make a positive contribution to the environment, to society, and have strong governance measures, things like diversification and equality. So we're on a journey now from excluding sectors we don't like to investing in companies that we do like and who are adopting the right approaches, which seem to be a more positive approach.
Now, back in the 1980s, of course, greed was good. Is that still the case in 2018, or have investors developed a conscience? Can they actually make money out of ESG investments?
And that is a key question, because traditionally ethical investments were deemed to be a compromise between your principles on one side and the profits you want to make on the other. That again has changed, and the argument with ESG is that if you're investing in companies that are adopting the right practices, then in the longer term they will be the more successful companies. The proof of the pudding isn't yet seen. We don't yet know how that plays itself out, but people can now invest in these companies and in these funds without the starting point that actually they're probably going to lose out by doing so. So the answer is yes. Hopefully there is more scope, one, to invest with your principles, but also two, to invest in a profitable way.
And do we know who is investing in these ESG funds and companies? Is it just millennials, or are in older investors getting on board too?
Millennials seem to be the main area where there is interest in this sector. It does seem that the youth of today perhaps are more conscious about a lot of issues than people who are older. Unfortunately, it's older people that tend to have more money. So it's older people who have more influence in terms of inflows. We do see certain sectors of society, in terms of older people, who are investing more. For example, the company I work for run a service for the medical profession. And we get lots of doctors who are interested in investing ethically. Now, that may well be because of the altruistic nature of what they do, the harm that they see that gambling or tobacco or alcohol does. And so a lot of doctors, for example, do invest ethically. That's not really as yet transmitting itself through older investors. And so while there is more interest in ethical investing, the millennials, as they build wealth going forwards, you would hope and expect to see that actually translated into more money being invested.
What about corporate culture itself? Is that changing due to the fact that people are now essentially talking with their money and holding companies to account? They want to be able to trust the companies that they're investing in.
Yeah, it's not changing yet, or at least not to any great degree. It's gradually changing. What we are seeing is investment companies being more activist. They're going out there and demanding that companies act in the right way. We see that a lot in the news with things like executive pay and bonuses and the like, where shareholders now are standing up and objecting to that. That is a trend that should continue. It's a trend that looks very likely to continue for two reasons. One, as you alluded to, as more money goes into these funds, as millennials gain more wealth, then shareholders and group shareholders will have more influence. Also, number two is with traditional ethical investments, people have had to make an active decision to invest in them. They've had to decide, I want to invest ethically. Whereas with ESG, firms are now starting to adopt ESG in their general investment process. And so investors can be investing in ESG perhaps without realizing it. But what that means is there's more money behind that approach and more influence that these companies will have when they're dealing with the companies they're investing into.
So how important is it, Patrick, for investors to understand the different nuances of the funds that they're investing in? Do we really know what we're buying with ESG assets?
We really don't. With regard to ethical investments, it was pretty clear. You knew you were avoiding weapons manufacturers and alcohol and tobacco and gambling and all these things. ESG is far more subjective. Different companies are adopting entirely different approaches to it, and also in terms of the strictness as well. So it's all well and good for investment firms to say, yes, we take account of ESG in our investment process, but do they take account of it and use it, or do they take account of it and ignore it? And the only way that you can be sure of that is either one, by doing your research, or two, by using an investment professional who'll do that research for you. But at the moment, it's grey. At the moment, it's subjective. At the moment, it's quite new. And so we need to see more developments in that area.
Fascinating. Patrick, many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
No problem at all.
And finally this week, internet movie maker Netflix made its presence felt on the red carpet at this year's Venice Film Festival. But allowing streaming services into the competition is not something that everyone's happy about. Nadim Barber reports from Venice.
Venice, a city known for its unchanging beauty. But over at the International Film Festival, they're moving boldly into the future. Well, that's what the organisers say anyhow. They've put on a record 6 films backed by the online platform Netflix, including the latest Coen brothers film. And Alessio Cremonini's crime drama On My Skin, based on a real-life case of a death in police custody. It'll be released on the same day on Netflix and in Italian movie theatres. But for most of the Netflix films, including this newly finished final film from the late Orson Welles, it's not clear how widely they'll be screened and for how long. And that's worrying some in the industry who are involved in nurturing new talent.
It's about the business model, and if Netflix keeps going, where's the place for everybody else in the room? Cinematic process has a lot of integrity in the way that it develops and includes. And ultimately, that experience is for everyone to be in a cinema.
This week, the International Confederation of Art Cinemas urged Venice to reserve competition slots for, quote, works of art that will be seen in cinemas internationally. But for this Venice veteran, it's time for change.
I approve of Netflix, I approve of Amazon, I approve of anybody who's prepared to give money to people who make films, who would otherwise not get the money. So I don't think it'll make any difference at all to the type of films being made, because Netflix will keep on saying you can make the film as you want.
Here at Venice's industry section, business is brisk as people look for a deal to support their films or their ideas.
More and more of those deals are being struck with online platforms like Netflix and Amazon, which means more films that the public can choose to see either at the cinema or on devices like their smartphones.
But the man heading this part of the festival rejects worries that Netflix will make it harder for independent filmmakers to break through.
I would say Netflix is not the first choice for them. But for some other project, like VR and something like that, of course, they are more looking to make business with Netflix or Amazon.
Netflix didn't have anyone for us to talk to in Venice, but it's clear that in just a few years they've shaken up the industry. And the real impact is still being debated. Nadim Barber, Venice, for Counting the Cost.
And that is our show for this week. If you want to get in touch with us about anything that you've seen on the programme, you can tweet me. I'm at @afinnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you can do, or you could drop us a line. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. There is plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our webpage, which has individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.